These later essays, the thought and negation, that, as I say, there's some extracted passages on the website, give me an excuse to pull together some of the material from the last couple of weeks on the topics of force and content on the one hand, and Sinn and Bedeutung on the other, and their interactions. So where I'd like to start is with the idea that a way to think about sense and reference in Frege is as generating two different semantic substitutional hierarchies. If we think about using his analytic method of noting invariance under substitution and using the equivalence relation of being intersubstitutable, saving something semantic as the equivalence relation to define an abstraction to get to notions of sense and reference. And thought of that way, the Bedeutung hierarchy starts off with a top-level notion of truth on the semantic side, assertion on the pragmatic side of force. Brandom distinguishes the freestanding content of sentences from the ingredient content. Says the freestanding content is the content that's force relevant, the content that you need to think about in order to understand the use of the expression. So a notion of truth that's correlative, that's the semantic notion that's correlative with the pragmatic notion of asserting as a doing that is a taking true, or we could say for which the notion of truth provides a norm for assessment of the success of assertions. And then we can look at ingredient contents by noting invariance salva veritate. So look at complex sentences. We're using this apparatus analytically to carve up the sentences. And some of them we can see have sentences as parts or maybe as arguments that functions are applied to. And we can assimilate the sentences insofar as substituting one for the other doesn't affect the truth of the compound sentences that they're involved in. And Dummett points out that those two notions of content, the freestanding notion, truth value, and the notion of ingredient content, intersubstitutable salva veritate, saving the freestanding notion of content, those needn't coincide. And last time I explored multi-valued logics that are what you get when they don't coincide. When you distinguish the value of something as designated or not, paradigmatically true or not, and then distinguish various multi-values which have the same ingredient value, substituting one for the other never affects the designatedness, the truth of the compound sentence that they occur in, but it can change the multi-value of it. And we can actually turn the crank one more time on that apparatus and assign Bedeutungen to subsentential expressions, expressions that don't have a freestanding use, that can't be used to make assertions, that don't take truth values, paradigmatically singular terms, or the predicates that express concepts for Frege. But again, we can assimilate those subsentential expressions into equivalence classes accordingly as intersubstituting them doesn't affect the ingredient content of the sentences they occur in, and so they're intersubstitutable salva veritate, saving the truth value of the larger sentences that they're involved in. So on the left-hand column of page 2 of the handout, you see this hierarchy of notions of content, but content, I'm claiming, in the sense of Bedeutung. One of the things we know about Bedeutungen is they're intersubstitutable salva veritate. That was the Tugendhat take on Frege's notion of Bedeutung. And there is a kind of, there's a notion of extensionality that consists in the top level notions holding for the lower level notions. So one notion of extensionality is if the only two multi-values in your multi-valued logic, the only two ingredient contents that you have are just the two top level true or false levels. In that sense, the extensional version of multi-valued logic is classical two-valued logic. And in the same way, if we take the other dimension that contrasts with the Tugendhat intersubstitutability salva veritate notion of Bedeutung, the sense in which the paradigm of the Bedeutung of an expression is the object referred to by a singular term, what I called the Fido picture. That's speaking to the very bottom of this salva veritate Bedeutung hierarchy. And there's another notion of extensionality. If intersubstituting co-referential expressions doesn't change the ingredient value of any of the sentences, and of course preserving the ingredient content is enough to preserve the freestanding content. So if you can determine these values from the bottom up, that's a notion of extensionality, that the analytic method carving up the sentences substitutionally doesn't lead you to anything that cuts finer than the objects referred to by the singular terms. And that's basically the story that Quine tells about extensional logic and semantics. So, So there's two notions of Bedeutung in play, or two models of it. The substitutional one that's epitomized in this hierarchy, and the name-bearer relation. And again, I quoted Dummett saying, there wasn't any reason sort of a priori why those two roles ought to coincide. The Tugendhat intersubstitutable salva veritate notion of Bedeutung, and the notion that comes from starting with the objects referred to, or the extensions of the predicates, and building up. So I think that story is pretty straightforward and familiar, since it's the origin story of the classical logic we all love and hate. It's a more complicated story on the side of senses. And I suggested that we could think of it as parallel to the story about Bedeutungen, at least as far as the substitutional hierarchy is concerned. There isn't anything corresponding to the name-bearer model on the side of senses. But I suggested that we could think of senses as what you get if you just parallel the use of the substitutional scalpel to carve out notions of sense on the side of Bedeutung by looking at intersubstitutions salva veritate, that the way to get the hierarchy of notions of sense that corresponds to that is to look at intersubstitution salva consequentiae, where the top notion is not the sort of goodness of a sentence that consists in its truth, but the goodness of an implication that consists in the premises actually providing a reason for the conclusion, an argument for it, the conclusion actually following from the premises. So here the top level notion is reason relations holding. So reason relations is my generic term for relations of implication or consequence on the one hand, but also non-trivially for incompatibility, what's going to be made explicit by negations. So at the top level, you start with a partition of, I'll just talk about the consequences, the candidate consequences or candidate implications, that is, pick an arbitrary set of premises and an arbitrary conclusion. We say, well, does the conclusion follow from the premises? Do the premises imply it? All those candidate implications, some of them, yes, they actually follow. They're actually good implications. And that, for this hierarchy, is our top level pragmatically relevant notion. The thought is that implication relations are what underwrite, in practice, assessment of what's a reason for what, and incompatibility relations codify relations of being a reason against something else. These premises are a reason against this conclusion. So just as Dummett suggested, you start with a notion of freestanding content, which is a semantic notion that has immediate pragmatic consequences. So for truth, it's connected to assertion. It's the notion on the side of content that goes with the notion of assertion on the side of force. And I'm saying the reason relations are the semantic things that have their immediate pragmatic significance on the side of force, of determining what's a reason for and what's a reason against what. So I'm thinking of the pragmatics as a matter of making claims and challenging and defending them by giving reasons against them and reasons for them. That's a very stripped down model, but that's sufficient to get these top level notions in play. And then we can say that two sentences have the same freestanding sentential role or sense in case they're intersubstitutable salva consequentiae. That is, if you hold the rest of the reason relation, the rest of the premises and the conclusion fixed, and swap Q for P, if you started with a good implication, swapping Q for P will never turn it into a bad implication, and vice versa. So we get, at the second level, a notion of sentential content. We started with the notion of reason relations, either holding or not holding, being good consequences or incompatibilities or not, but we get a notion of sentential content from that, and I suggest that's where the notion of sense starts. But then sentences can be parts of other sentences, so we can turn the crank another time on that substitutional machinery and assign ingredient senses in case substituting the one sentence for the other as a component of more complex sentences is salva consequentiae, never turns a good implication into a bad one. And we could turn the crank one more time and look at the subsentential roles of these things. So we get one extra layer if we do this starting with consequences rather than sentences, because we need to use the substitutional machinery to attribute senses to sentences already. But otherwise, it's exactly parallel. And again, we can imagine a notion of extensionality that says, well, you could read this from the bottom. And if you have a take on what the senses of sentences are, or even of subsentential expressions, if that take lets you determine the ingredient sense of sentences, then the freestanding sense of sentences, and derive from that the goodness of reason relations, that would be extensionality in the inferential consequential substitutional semantic hierarchy, entirely parallel to the one on the side of truth and Bedeutung. So my interpretive suggestion was that we think generically about sense and reference in terms of substitution salva consequentiae and salva veritate. And these hierarchies are what you get if you do that. I think it's worth keeping in mind that there's another sense of extensionality, which you get if you say, yeah, and the Bedeutungen determine the senses. That all you need to know in order to know what's intersubstitutable salva consequentiae is what's intersubstitutable salva veritate. And that's also a sense of extensional that we find in Quine that he's using. So there's extensionality within these hierarchies, sort of from the bottom up, and extensionality between them. And all these notions could come apart. They're all run together in the Quinean interpretation of sort of logic from a Tarskian point of view. So that's the philosophical background behind the discussion of multivalued logics last time, which was understanding the multivalued logics as a formal language, limited in its expressive power, but still regimenting the distinctions between these different kinds of senses. So I hope all of that's just recap. Now we also had in play what I called a computational model of senses. So Frege says senses, on the one hand, contain modes of presentation of the Bedeutungen of the expressions. So the phrase "the morning star" contains a mode of presentation of Venus, a way of thinking about it. And he says, well, as I'm interpreting him, and the senses determine the inferential roles of the expressions, the inferential role in the sense it's given by the various levels of the substitutional hierarchy salva consequentiae. So that those are the two functions that the notion of sense is being called on to perform. Is a non-trivial interpretive claim of mine that his relatively loose talk about cognitive value really ought to be understood in terms of inferential roles. But I just want to register that if that's wrong, then this computational story is not really going to fly. And I suggested that the modes of presentation are ways of computing the Bedeutungen in the sort of literal sense that the Bedeutungen are the values of functions applied to arguments. So, in the case of the morning star, it's the heavenly body that is visible when none other but the sun is visible in the morning. That's telling us how to compute which heavenly body we're talking about from the information that's given in calling it the morning star. That we think of modes of presentation as functions applied to arguments. FATAs, functions applied to arguments, whose value is the Bedeutung. Now we say, well, the senses contain these modes of presentation. What ties them together as modes of presentation that add up to one sense? And here I suggested we think about Frege's claim right from the beginning in the Begriffsschrift that one expression can be analyzed into functions and arguments in multiple ways. 2 to the 4th, that expression can be analyzed into the application to the argument 2 of the function, raise it to the 4th power. You're going to get the result. The value is going to be 16, which is indeed the Bedeutung of the expression 2 to the 4th. But we can also analyze it as the application to the argument 4 of raise 2 to this power. That also is going to be a designation of 16, the very same Bedeutung. We can understand it as, we can analyze it substitutionally, functionally, also as the application of the argument raise x to the y power to the arguments 2 and 4. Again, we get the same Bedeutung, 16. Those are all modes of presentation of 16 that I claim make up the sense of the expression 2 to the 4th for Frege, that the sense consists in all the functional decompositions that expression admits by treating some of its sub-expressions as variable, substitutable, and holding others fixed. But all of those are going to yield the same value for the whole expression. The sense is only going to consist of modes of presentation of that Bedeutung, and it's going to be all and only the modes of presentation that are functions applied to arguments into which you can decompose the expression. So I propose to identify the sense with this collection of modes of presentation, which correspond to all the functional decompositions, all the things you can get by wielding your substitutional scalpel to carve it up into functions and arguments, that those are the modes of presentation. Well, what about the other side of senses? It's to determine the inferential role. Well, I pointed out that each one of these functions applied to an argument, each one of these substitutional decompositions of the expression, just by picking out the function that it does, determines a pattern of inferences that the whole expression is involved in. So if we understand if we look at the mode of presentation that's applied to the argument 2, raised to the 4th power, we have this function raising some x to the 4th power. Well, we know that x raised to the 4th power is the same as x times x times x times x. That's always going to be a true identity. That licenses substitution inferences that are going to be among the inferences that that expression 2 to the 4th stands in. If instead we analyze it into the application to the argument 2 of raising to the yth power, we know that that's always going to be 2 times 2 times 2 y times. That's a true identity. And again, that determines a pattern of inferences that the expression 2 to the 4th is characterized by. So I said, so we can see a way in which the very same thing, a constellation of functions applied to arguments into which you can dissect the original expression substitutionally. If we identify the sense with that set of functions applied to arguments, we'll see they all are modes of presentation of the same Bedeutung in the computational sense that if you apply that function to that argument, the value is 16, is the Bedeutung of the whole expression. And we can see that as at least relevant to determining some of the implications in which that expression plays a role. So that was the computational model on the side of senses. That also gave us a relation between these two hierarchies, and so the notion of sense and the notion of Bedeutung, because the senses are, as he says, the senses contain, as he says, modes of presentation of the Bedeutungen. So that's a connection across the boundary between the sense hierarchy of intersubstitutability salva consequentiae and the Bedeutung hierarchy of intersubstitutability salva veritate. So we actually have three things that we know about Bedeutungen. One, they're intersubstitutable salva veritate. Two, the Bedeutung of the expression quote, corner quote t is just t. The Bedeutung of Fido is just Fido. But now we know this third thing, that the Bedeutungen are computed by modes of presentation in senses. So the values of functions applied to arguments. Now we're going to see we need a fourth relation between these as well. But already I was suggesting one of the important senses of extensional has to do with the relation between these hierarchies, between the Bedeutung salva veritate hierarchy and the sense salva consequentiae hierarchy. And we see one relation, one such relation, namely the modes of presentation on the side of senses are computations of the values that are the Bedeutung. Okay, so all of that I hope sounds familiar. That's a picture I've been putting in place over the last couple of weeks. If we go back just a little bit farther, though, a couple of weeks ago I was talking about conceptual ampliativity, novelty, the notion that you can get something new inferentially out of a set of premises. Frege cares about this when he's looking at the logical elaboration of the logical inferential elaboration of some set of premises. He wants to say, look, Kant was wrong to think that you can't get anything new by doing that. You really can get something new. And I suggested that the overall question of ampliativity here isn't necessarily about logic. It's really about multi-premise inferences. How is it that by putting a bunch of premises together, you can get a conclusion that contains things that aren't contained in any of the premises individually? I mean, we're very used to this, right? If you have P and if P then Q, they have as their conclusion Q, and that isn't contained in, it isn't implicit in, it isn't implied by either of the premises by itself. But it's contained in the set of them, even though it's not contained severally in the premises. And I suggested that this phenomenon was one that the philosophical tradition pre-Frege had not figured out. They didn't have a story, really, about how you could get more out of a set of premises than you put in. And if we look at syllogistic reasoning, we see, well, what everybody complained about, the emptiness of logic, was that the conclusion really is contained always in the major premise of the syllogism. In the syllogism in Barbara, the major premise says all A's are B's. Well, then if all B's are C's, you've already got the C's contained in the A's. If it's a syllogism in Celerent, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal really contained already in all men are mortal. The minor premise is just telling you, how to extract what's in already that major premise. So Frege needs to worry about how to understand, how to make intelligible the possibility of a set of premises containing implicitly, in the literal sense of implying, something that isn't contained in, even implicitly, not implied by any of the constituent premises, any of the individual premises. So it's fair for us to ask about this computational model of senses. What's its solution? What does it teach us? How does it make intelligible the notion of non-trivially multi-premise implications? And there's going to be a similar question about incompatibilities, how a set of claims can be incompatible with something that isn't incompatible with any of the individual things. And if we transmute that question into the computational model, I think we don't see an answer to it. The claim was you can see senses as collections of modes of presentation, of functions applied to arguments that can all compute the same value, the Bedeutung. You can see how the occurrence of each of those modes of presentation determines some of the inferences that the whole expression is involved in. But does it give us the resources to say how they combine to give us something that we didn't have before? I mentioned as more than a mere historical curiosity that this is really an origin, anyway, of Kant's notion of synthesis. He says, well, you've got to put these together, these premises together in a distinctive way, and then uses that same notion of synthesis to say, well, in a claim, you have to put the pieces of that together in this distinctive synthetic way in order to get a substantive claim, a claim that goes beyond what was in already the pieces that you put together. So in discussing the kite of conceptual ampliativity, the different ways in which different specifically logical locutions could be thought to give you the leverage to move beyond what was individually contained in things, starting with complex predicates, with as Dummett taught us to think about them, looking at alternating quantifiers as the Hinticke-Friedman model of Kantian synthesis in terms of Skolem functions had it, to look at abstraction as a way of introducing new contents based on old ones by substitution, by forming an equivalence class, but substitution is an instance of that. But what are we to say? Isn't it a criterion of adequacy of our model of senses that it should make sense of multi-premise inferences, of your being able to combine the senses of different sentences? For this, I think we don't need to look at anything other than sentences, but we can look at sentences that are parts of other sentences if we want. But what is its story about how a set of premises can have implications that no individual one of them does? And I think the computational model doesn't tell us that. It gives us a way to be more precise about what we're looking for. What we'd want is to say how the modes of presentation of truth values of different sentences, each one of which is a function applied to an argument, how you could pick some from each of the premises and put them together to get modes of presentation of the true, again, ways of computing the same conclusion, but that are different than what you've got in the modes of presentation of any one of the particular premises. Some of them, if you pick right of the modes of presentation, you can put them together and get a new mode of presentation. But what do we mean by putting them together, and how do you pick the ones from this premise and from this other premise that go together in order to get you this new conclusion? If you pick these others, presumably you get this other new conclusion. If we've got 20 premises and 5 new claims follow from them, there've got to be ways of arranging the pieces of the senses of the premises in order to get the sense of the new sentences that are the conclusions. So we, in that sense, have a somewhat more precise way of thinking about what we want here, what it would take to give a responsive answer to this question about how to understand so much as the possibility of essentially multi-premise inferences, where essentially means that the conclusion doesn't follow from any proper subset of the premises. Now, Frege has an answer to this, provided the sentences we're putting together are logically complex. Because the way he introduces the conditional negation, we don't really need to look beyond that, gives us rules for combining them to get new stuff out of them, paradigmatically modus ponens, so that he has a story about why P and if P then Q have Q as a consequence that isn't a consequence of either of them. That's part of the meaning of the conditional, is hypothetical stroke. And in the same way, we can see how combining it with negation would give us, by contraposition would give us something that we didn't have before. But that's a very specialized solution to this problem. The problem is a general one. Multi-premise inferences are not, in general, restricted to logically complex sentences. If John left his house at noon and he was walking and he walks 4 miles an hour and we're a mile away from him, then he ought to be here in 15 minutes after noon. There's just all kinds of multi-premise reasoning that we do that isn't specifically logical. Now, one response you might have to that is say, well, it must be covertly logical. You must be able to dissolve or analyze all these sentences into underlying logically complex sentences such that the conclusion that follows from all of them does follow logically from this deep structure, the deep logical structure. And something like that was basically the program of analytic philosophy, as Russell set it out, was to understand all the inferences, at least all the ones we need for science, but all the ones really that are good inferences, by imputing covert logical structure to them in such a way that if you combine those, that you can then combine those logically complex sentences in order to get the new sentences that are the consequences. And the Tractatus is already a picture of that way of thinking about things. Still, is there another more general picture or model of how multi-premise inferences are possible? How can we make intelligible the possibility of getting something new out of these premises, something that wasn't in them severally but is in them collectively? Is there a new model for that? And I think, yes, there is, and Frege gives us the conceptual raw materials that we need for it. What we need is just his method of assimilating expressions accordingly as intersubstitution preserves something, some antecedent thing that we already had, the same methodology that generates these two hierarchies of sense and reference. I think there is an answer to that general question, a model of how that works that appeals only to the substitutional methodology. But Frege didn't find it. He didn't take the extra step of applying that apparatus in the way that he needed to get this concluded, to get this result. But Bolzano did. Bolzano gives us the missing piece here. And Bolzano does this because he's thinking hard about the same question Kant was thinking hard about. How can we make sense of getting something new by putting together old things, things we've already got, something new that isn't in those parts. Now there's, well, what's in, what's contained in, but in the computational model we have a specific thing to mean by that. What's in the sense is the modes of presentation of it. So, can we put constraints on that tells us how to combine some of the modes of presentation of premise 1 with some of the modes of presentation of premise 2 with some of the modes of presentation of premise 3 to get a whole that involves the presentation, involves a new function in this way, a new mode of presentation of, if it's implications we care about, it's going to be a name of the true, but it's a new name, not any of the old ones. Not just any random way of combining those modes of presentation is going to give you a coherent sense. So one way of thinking about it is, well, what are the constraints on combining those modes of presentation so as to get a new mode of presentation, a new way of computing, since implications are truth-preserving, a new name of the true. But we can say what it is for it to be a new name. It has to be a different collection of modes of presentation of it, all of which are available by analyzing it, right? Analyzing the conclusion. That's what the computational model tells us. So that's a pretty well-defined question or challenge, technically. How can you do that? How should we think philosophically about what those constraints are? And now, as I say, at this point, I think we've described a sort of hole in the system, a lack in the system. It needs an account of how you get new senses out of old ones inferentially. And that whole is fit exactly by Bolzano's definition of consequence. From his point of view, all Frege had to do was apply his substitutional method, his method of carving something up into a function and an argument by treating some of the vocabulary as fixed and looking at all the variations of the other vocabulary and observing invariance under that process. All Frege had to do to answer this question was to apply that at the level of implications instead of just at the level of sentences. Now, in a sense, Frege already did. If you look at the top two levels of the consequential hierarchy, the top one's talking about the goodness of implications, and we're getting our notion of freestanding sense of sentences, that is our notion of a thought, because a thought is his name for the sense of a sentence. We're saying the two sentences have expressed the same thought, just in case substituting one for the other never changes the goodness of any of the implications or incompatibilities involving them. That actually is applying the substitutional methodology at the level of implications rather than at the level of sentences. But Frege never talks about functions defined that way. Functions are parts of sentences for him. He doesn't explicitly apply the function argument analysis to anything larger than sentences. And that's what Bolzano does. Bolzano just talks about fixed and variable elements, and so substitutions, Ersetzbarkeit, he's using the same word that Frege uses, replaceability, literally, it's where the by now quasi-English word ersatz comes from, a substitute for something. And Bolzano says what it is for a premise set gamma to imply a conclusion A is that there is some way of partitioning the vocabulary, not now the vocabulary just of a sentence, but the vocabulary of the whole implication. So we've got all the premises here with their vocabulary in it, sentences inside sentences, subsentential parts inside there. But now we've got different premises, so they have different elements in them. There's going to have to be some repetitions among them for there to be new things coming out of the sentence. But he says, take all that vocabulary, partition it into fixed and variable. And what it is for gamma to imply A is that every partition of the vocabulary such that all the replacements of the variable vocabulary make all the premises true, also make the conclusion true. So the base idea is that relative to a partition, the implication is good if every replacement of variable vocabulary for variable vocabulary that makes all the premises true makes the conclusion true. And gamma implies A if there is any such partition. Now, that's an iterated quantifier there. Gamma implies A if there is, existential quantifier out front, a partition of vocabulary, of the vocabulary of the elements of gamma and of A into fixed and variable, such that every replacement, that's the for all, every replacement of variable vocabulary for variable vocabulary that makes all the premises true also makes the conclusion true. Parenthetically, remember it's exactly the same form of definition for incompatibility. If there is a partition such that every replacement of variable for variable vocabulary that makes all the premises true makes the conclusion false, then the premises are incompatible with the conclusion. So having said that, I'm just going to talk about consequence, but explicitly in Bolzano, he's considering both of these. Yeah, Nikki.
From not an interesting question, but did I hear correctly earlier that you said Frege came up with Ersatz? As in like Ersatz, the German word for substitution?
No.
Okay.
No, sorry.
I would have flabbergasted. Okay.
No. I mean, because from Zetzen, it's too. No.
I thought, wow.
Okay.
This whole time I thought it had something to do with Zetzen, but now it's Frege returned it from Zetzen. No, go.
Well, and I'm not even talking about Zetzen as its use as positing.
Yeah.
So Ersatzbarkeit is a notion beyond positing. You have to think more relationally for this. But no, the claim just was that Bolzano sometimes uses that very same word, substitution. His favorite word is variation. But he's talking about the same thing. But we can see in this, and then I was saying, and Ersatz became, I think in the 30s and 40s, and English was taken over from German. But but we can see that Bolzano crucially applied this method of distinguishing between fixed and variable vocabulary and looking at what's invariant under all of the substitutions for the variable vocabulary. Bolzano applied this in a way that's more general than Frege did along a crucial dimension. He applied it to whole implications, indeed to the whole language. When he's talking about a partition of the vocabulary into fixed and variable, well, if you're only interested in one implication, then that can be relative to a partition just of the vocabulary in that partition. But if you're interested in everything that follows from this premise set, you've got to look at all the candidate implications that have different conclusions with all the different parts in them. So Bolzano is always thinking about this as a partition of all the vocabulary in the language. Indeed, it's not specific to the language for him, it's all the Vorstellungen, though remember he doesn't think there is a definite totality of all of them, but picking some one here. And because he's thinking of that, he's thinking of using the substitutional methodology at that level of maximal generality, he can give us the form of an answer to the question, how can you get new things out of a set of premises? How are we to understand the possibility of multi-premise inferences that have consequences that are not consequences of any of the parts? It's this substitutional story. It's absolutely available to Frege, except that he only uses the function argument analysis on wholes no larger than a sentence. He never uses it for the whole implication relations. Now, in his defense, Frege would say, well, if there's an implication, we can put that into the form of a sentence. That's what conditionals are for. That's what the Begriffsschrift is for. So in that way, it ought to be enough to work at the level of sentences. Well, if all the ways of putting multiple premises together to get new conclusions can be reconstructed as logically good implications from their underlying structure, then that's good enough. But as a general account, the Boltzanian account is exactly what we need. So no historical figure actually held the view that I'm trying to put on the table here. It's Frege understood in this computational way, and then adding Bolzano's account of the validity, the goodness of multi-premise inferences, which is just another application, another turn of the crank in the substitutional machinery that he shares with Frege. But looking at the mathematics of his time, Bolzano couldn't see the notion of function generalized to, for instance, functions that had truth values as values or arguments. Frege, looking back over the next 50 years of mathematics, could do that, but it also blinkered him. Using the function argument model for substitutional analysis made it hard for Frege to see that you could do you could do the same thing to whole arguments, even though he actually implicitly had done that at the top of the consequential inferential hierarchy. Now, I said from within the computational model, we could see the question as being, how do you put together the modes of presentation that are contained in the senses of the premises in order to operate on them somehow and get modes of presentation that are different from the modes of presentation of any of the senses of any of the premises, that they're not contained in any of them. And we see Bolzano's solution to this question. Nobody ever asked him, in this form. But as I say, he came up with this definition as a way of thinking about the question Kant had asked himself: how can we make intelligible essentially multi-premise inferences whose conclusions are not contained in the contents of any of the premises? And he says, well, the only way to characterize the mode of combination of these modes of presentation, you can't do it atomistically, building up from these senses. You have to do it by going up a level and looking at substitutional invariance with respect to the whole implications in this multiply quantified way. I'll point out parenthetically that the Skolem function argument for novelty, the Skolem function interpretation of Kantian synthesis, says it's not enough to have just complex predicates in the Demetian sense. You've got to have a for all there is. And the Skolem function takes any argument and computes a witness, computes the there is. And I pointed out that this is exactly what we find in the ampliative productive arguments in Euclid that are contrasted with the emptiness of syllogism, when he is able to show that between any 2 points there's a midpoint. For any 2 points there is a point that is in between them. That was alternating quantifiers for all there exists. The Bolzano account of the intelligibility of essentially multi-premise inference is there is for all. It's the opposite order of the quantifiers. Gamma implies A in case there is a partition of the vocabulary into fixed and variable. That's the existential quantifier, such that for all replacements of the variable vocabulary that make all the elements of gamma true, those same replacements make A true. So that's the invariance under substitution. Still need alternating quantifiers, but do them in the other order. I mean, there's a limit to how deep that point can be because we know we can swap these around with negations, right? And sort of turn. If you've got the one kind, you can get the other along with negation. So I say this, although I'm claiming the Fregean account has a hole in it. If we think of Frege as aiming at a semantic scheme to include non-logical reasoning, because for the case of logical reasoning, he solves that. But his solution doesn't generalize to other kinds of inference that don't involve logically complex expressions. So you might think, okay, then all essentially multi-premise inferences must have premises and conclusions that have covert logical structure. Then you're an analytic philosopher. That was the founding vision of analytic philosophy. I think 125 years in, we said it hasn't worked out all that well. That is, finding the implicit logical structure hasn't. But there's another way to go, to extend the apparatus. Bolzano's account does not in any way privilege logical vocabulary. You might hold that fixed and observe invariance under it. If you want to do logic, that's what you do. If you care about what implications are logically good in virtue of their logical form, which means their form when all you hold fixed is the logical vocabulary and let everything else vary, that gives you the logically good implications. But in the same way, we can hold the geological vocabulary fixed, or the theological, or the culinary, the nautical, and so on. Each of those is an equally good sense of good implication. At least at the semantic level, they're equally good. The second two volumes of Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre is the epistemological, methodological part, where he says, well, but some of these ways of analyzing by partitioning into fixed and variable vocabulary will be better in this scientific context than some others. Can we say anything heuristically about when one way of dividing the vocabulary gives us a sense of good implication that is scientifically useful, empirically useful? And he wants to say, yeah, it turns out there are rules of thumb, there are things you can say about that. Bolzano is explicitly trying to make sense of this notion of essentially multi-premise implications and incompatibilities in a way that does not privilege logical vocabulary. And that's sort of why he didn't invent logic. He wasn't interested in trying to make that work. But he was doing this other more general thing. And when we confront the Fregean apparatus, we see, well, Bolzano isn't using any conceptual machinery at the theoretical level that Frege didn't have. Indeed, in many ways, Frege thought harder about that substitutional methodology than Bolzano did, but not as generally or as broadly as Bolzano did. So I'm suggesting extending the computational model of senses by adding to it the Bolzano definition of the goodness of implications and incompatibilities. It's substitutional all the way through, and Frege has truth values as objects for him. They're not objects for Bolzano, but he's only appealing to truth values, which Frege is all on board with. But let me point out that this is another connection between Sinn and Bedeutung, between the two substitutional hierarchies. This is saying that the inferential significance of expressions, well, let's say sentences, so on the side of intersubstitution salva consequentiae, so two expressions have the same sense, in case substituting one for the other never turns a good implication into a bad implication. They have the same sense, that is, they play the same inferential role in that sense. The abstraction that you get by using the equivalence relation of intersubstitutability salva consequentiae introduces inferential roles as things. The inferential role of an expression is the same as the inferential role of another if they can be intersubstituted salva consequentiae. That's introducing a new sortal concept, inferential role by abstraction, and telling us how to individuate them anyway. But to understand that notion of inferential role on the side of Sinn, if we go Bolzano-wise, we have to appeal to truth conditions. We use the truth conditions, that is the Bedeutungen of sentences, together with the substitutional methodology, in order to define the goodness of implications. In this regard, for Bolzano, it's truth values all the way down. You don't need to look beyond truth values in the context of the substitutional methodology in order to understand the goodness of inference, which is the top level notion of the Sinn hierarchy, the hierarchy of abstracting by noting invariance salva consequentiae of things. So I said a little while ago, we started off with two notions, two handles on the notion of Bedeutung, two roles that that notion is supposed to play. On the one hand, we get to Bedeutungen by abstraction, saying that two expressions have the same Bedeutung, compare two lines have the same direction, just in case they're intersubstitutable salva veritate, that is, just in case they're parallel. The abstractor, the equivalence relation, is intersubstitutability saving truth value. So we have that Tugendhat notion of Bedeutung. We have the name bearer model of it, which Dummett complains is hard to reconcile with the Tugendhat notion, and he thinks it's disastrous if Quine-wise you make the name bearer notion try and do all the work of the intersubstitution notion. We have those two aspects of Bedeutung, and then we have an aspect that's inherited from the other hierarchy, not a matter of intersubstitutability salva veritate, but that senses contain, and I'm saying consist of, modes of presentation of Bedeutungen, that is, ways of computing them in the literal sense of applying a function to an argument whose value is the Bedeutung. So that's forging a connection between the two hierarchies and giving us a third handle on the notion of Bedeutung. It's what Sinne are modes of presentation of. Outdesgegeben is his term of art. Bedeutungen are what senses contain modes of presentation of. That's a third take on the notion of Bedeutung. And what Bolzano is giving us is a fourth take on the notion of Bedeutung and a second connection forged between the two hierarchies in saying, and the top level notion of the consequential hierarchy, the notion of a good implication or incompatibility, is one you have to understand substitutionally in terms of truth values, that is, in terms of the Bedeutungen of sentences. So where you might think the modes of presentation point is showing a dependence of the Bedeutung truth side on the sense consequence side, the Bolzano definition is going the other direction. It's showing a dependence of the sense consequence hierarchy on the notion of truth from the Bedeutung. That's the top level notion of the Bedeutung hierarchy. All of this gives a picture of the relations between, well, sense and reference in contemporary formal semantics is intensions and extensions. Intensions precisely as functions that apply to an expression and an index and give you the extension. So the intension is a rule or a function that if you give it a possible world will give you the extension of red or square in that world, all the red things, all the square things in that world. That's a very simple, spare representation of the semantic relations that I'm saying we can also think about in this much richer sense of thinking of the truth hierarchy and the implication or consequence hierarchy and the multiple connections between them. If we think in these substitutional terms that are common to Bolzano and Frege, it's just a much richer conceptual scheme or meta-conceptual scheme than the picture that says, well, there's intensions which are functions from an index to an extension. I mean, it turns out we can do a lot with that sparer notion, but there's going to be a lot that we can do with the richer notion as well, in particular if we're concerned to get our heads around, find a way of understanding the possibility of essentially multi-premise inferences, which is something we should have been worrying about all along. I'm not the kind of reader of the ancient Greeks who can say, well, actually, you can see them doing that there. And I can't say, no, they weren't. Yes, they were. My understanding starts later than that. Okay, so I said that by telling this story, I wanted to pull together themes from the last few sessions. This is going all the way back to the novelty notion, conceptual novelty, which I said that the underlying issue there is understanding the possibility of essentially multi-premise inferences. That's the most general characterization of the issue there. And then we looked at the distinction between sense and reference, the computational model of senses and the connections between them here, ingredient, freestanding content, generating these hierarchies, which I viewed through the formal lens of multivalued logic last time, but reaching all the way back then to Bolzano, week 6, I think, for the missing piece, the piece that would have completed this model for Frege, if and insofar as we think, Frege had this broader aim of giving us a semantic metavocabulary for reasoning generally, not just logical and mathematical reasoning. And of course, you remember in his preface to the Begriffsschrift and in his commentary on it, he said he at least then was thinking about the Begriffsschrift as being a concept notation, not just for mathematics, but for other things too, for physics and ultimately for chemistry and so on. What he accomplished only does that on the assumption of logical reducibility, of all good reasons ultimately being logically good reasons. That kind of logicism about reasons, not just good mathematical reasons or all at base logical reasons, but good reasons, period. That was the Russellian generalization of of Frege's program that got us analytic philosophy. Not for better or for worse. I mean, for better, but it's not to say there aren't bad things in it. And one of the constructive things to do about the bad things in it is to mine the history to find other ways we could have gone, other ways we still could go. So yeah, I'm claiming that in some sense implicit in Frege's account is an as fully articulated account that's expressively much more powerful if we help him to let him help himself to Bolzano's definition of the goodness of implications and incompatibilities. Okay, well, that's a good breaking place. When we come back, I'll talk about these late essays, the thought and negation, helping myself to some of this material, but talking about some somewhat different issues. So it's 2:18. Let's come back at 2:33. Okay. Well, having talked a lot about senses, because that's where the Boltzanian emendation of or addition to that computational model of senses comes in, but also about the relation between these hierarchies. I thought I'd talk some more about truth and its relation to assertion. And the thought is a good place to start. If you have access to the passages that I extracted, now's a good time to look at them. But he starts off the essay, which I should say in general, the thought is after Übersinn and Bedeutung, the most well-known and most read of Frege's essays. It's more approachable than many of them. So, just as beautiful points the way for aesthetics and good for ethics, so do words like true for logic. So these are all normative sciences. All sciences have truth as their goal, but logic is concerned with it in quite a different way. To discover truths is the task of all sciences. It falls to logic to discern the laws of truth. Well, the concept of truth, to use the concept of truth. He announces one of his big themes, the anti-psychologism. It's not thinkings, it's thoughts. The Bedeutung of the word true is spelled out in the laws of truth. All the different ways of understanding all the different ways of computing the value true. And then we get this famous but hard to process argument for the indefinability of truth. They say, well, we define it as correspondence, saying of what is that it is, correspondence between the thought and the world. But then we should have to inquire whether it's true that an idea and a reality, say, correspond in the specified respect. And then we should be confronted by a question of the same kind, and the game could begin again. So the attempted explanation of truth as correspondence breaks down, and any other attempt to define truth also breaks down. For in a definition, certain characteristics would have to be specified, and in application to any particular case, the question would always arise whether it were true that the characteristics were present. So we should be going around in a circle. So it seems likely that the content of the word true is sui generis and indefinable. Now, what's puzzling about this argument is you always could ask, is it true that, say, this fact corresponds to this claim? You could ask that, but is that enough to make it circular? It's only if your explanation depends on giving an answer to that question. Whereas if we could just explain correspondence without appeal to truth, why wouldn't that be good enough? Yes, the redundancy aspect of truth means whatever definition you gave, you could always ask, well, is that true? But you could ask that about the premise of any argument, ask whether it was true. There is a lot of discussion of this argument in the literature, and sui generis, yes, it's its own genus. True works differently than other properties do. Well, it's higher order. It's a meta concept. Anyway, there's a vast literature addressing this argument, and I just want to register the concern that he has here, not to say, oh, he demonstrates that it's indefinable. Without offering this as a definition, for those reasons, I call a thought something for which the question of truth can arise at all. So I count what's false among thoughts no less than what is true. So I can say thoughts are the senses of sentences. The thought, in itself imperceptible by the senses, gets clothed in a perceptible garb of a sentence, and thereby we're enabled to grasp it. We say that a sentence expresses a thought. So the sentence expresses the sense, which is the thought. If we skip down quite a ways in the essay, what is a fact? A fact is a thought that is true. This is John McDowell's favorite Frege quote, and for good reason. It's contrasting a Fregean notion of facts as true thoughts with the idea of facts as what correspond to true thoughts. It just is the true thought. The thought, in the sense of a thinkable rather than a thinking of it, in the negation essay Well, right, in the negation essay, he says, we're probably best in accord with ordinary usage if we take a judgment to be an act of judging, as a leap is an act of leaping. And a thought is the content of a thinking, the thing that is thought, rather than the thinking of it. So Sellers talks about the notorious ing-ed ambiguity, that words like action and perception and sensation have ambiguous between the acting and what is done, the judging and what is judged, the perceiving, the act of perceiving, and the content perceived, and points to Berkeley as a horrible example of someone who runs back and forth between these and assumes that anything thinkable must correspond to a thinking, in effect. So he's on his way to what I think he takes the major theme of the essay, The Thought, to be, namely, we have to postulate this third realm of thinkables, thoughts in the sense of thinkables, which are not like subjective thinkings. They don't have owners. They're objective in the sense that they're independent of whether anybody thinks them or whether they're thinkers at all. And in that regard are like the physical world, the actual world, wirklich, the world of processes of things acting on each other. It's objective like that, but thoughts are not wirklich. They're not actual. They don't have effects or causes. They're timeless. They're not in space or in time. Their connection to sort of making a causal difference, they can't be affected, but they can actually make a difference, but they need us to do it. What can be wirklich is our grasping of a thought, but they themselves are not. I think he has a semi-religious picture of the relation between us and these things. There are these objective thinkables, but for them to make any difference in the wirklich reality, they depend on us. We're the poor vessels by which they can make a difference if we think them and reason with them. And I sometimes imagine that the moral cum religious sensibility of this is, and if some potentially important thought lets you get within thinking distance of it, if you're in a position to grasp it, then you have sort of obligations to it, to do that and to make it wirklich, to make it effective, because it can't do it by itself. And after all, it's done you this favor, in effect, of letting you get within grasping distance of it. I mean, that's all fanciful, of course, but I think I see a sensibility like that in Frege, that's the way he thinks about these truths, these facts that sort of unaccountably depend on us fragile forked creatures to get at them. So again, when people talk about Frege's metaphysics, this third world of senses, personal senses, is one of the things they think about. That's not what I particularly want to talk about either. He says, so this is after the argument for the indefinability of truth, because any definition you gave, you'd lay down conditions, and we could ask, but are those conditions true? Does that hold? All the same, he says, it's something worth thinking about, that we cannot recognize a property of a thing without at the same time finding the thought, this thing has that property, to be true. It's taking the thought to be true that is recognizing that something has the property. So with every property of a thing, there's tied up a property of thought, namely truth. Well, there is tied up with it. The question is it presupposed in a way that would make your account circular? But tied up with it, yes. So how is that? It's also worth noticing that the sentence, I smell the scent of violets, has the same content as the sense, it's true that I smell the scent of violets. So it seems then that nothing is added to the thought by my ascribing it the property of truth. It's just redundant. Rorty says to call it true is to pay it an empty compliment, if you've already made the claim. Yet is it not a great result when the scientist, after much hesitation and laborious researches, can finally say, my conjecture is true? The Bedeutung of the word true seems to be altogether sui generis. It's the only thing of its kind. May we not be dealing here with something which cannot be called a property in the ordinary sense at all? Well, indeed. That's the thought I want to pursue a little bit, that it's grammatically a predicate, but is it a property? And he goes on, just a couple sentences later, therefore there are two things that must be distinguished in an assertoric sentence. The content, which it has, for instance, in common with the corresponding propositional question, is it the case that P, and assertion. The former is the thought, or at least contains the thought, so it's possible to express a thought without laying it down as true. The two things are so closely conjoined in an assertoric sentence that it's easy to overlook their separability. Consequently, we must distinguish the grasp of a thought, thinking, the acknowledgement of the truth of a thought, the act of judgment, or judging, and the manifestation of this judgment, asserting. So Dummett says you can either think of assertion as the outward visible manifestation of an inward invisible judgment, and that's basically the way everybody among the modern philosophers thought of it. Or you can think of judging as the inward invisible correlate of an outward visible act of judging. And Dummett takes the revolution in philosophy that treats philosophy of language as first philosophy, that he traces to Frege as identifiable with, identical to, adopting that second order of explanation that goes from assertion to judgment, rather than from judgment to assertion. But there's also then the question of what's the relation between that and the thought, in the sense of the thinkable, the content of it. Because here, thinking, judging, and asserting, those are all acts. Those are all things you can do. They're things that you're going to specify in a pragmatic metavocabulary meant for talking about what you're doing when you're talking. But there's also the content that's a matter of what you're thinking, judging or saying when you're thinking, judging, or asserting. And again, we've got potentially two orders of explanation, one that starts with the thought and understands the acts in terms of the propositional content, a semantics first order of explanation, in other words, that says we've got to get clear about what a thinkable is, what a claimable is, what a judgeable is. And then we can understand, in terms of that, the various attitudes towards it, practical and doxastic, that we might take up, understand asserting as the public taking true of the thought, the judging as the private taking true of it, and the thinking merely as the entertaining of the content. And there's a pragmatics first order of explanation that says, no, get clear about what you're doing in asserting, judging, or thinking in order to understand thoughts, in order to understand thinkables, judgeables, claimables. And I think in the philosophy of language, these semantics first order of explanation and pragmatics first orders of explanation, this really is a big fork in the road. The counsel of wisdom might always be the route that John McDowell takes, which is to say you must strenuously resist all the reductive impulses to do with one of these and understand the other in terms of it. What you want to do is understand the relation between them. And yes, it would be one way to do it would be if you could get an independent grip on one of them and understand the other one in terms of it. That would be one form of understanding the relation between them. But in philosophically interesting cases, he says that's hardly ever going to be the case. Almost always you're going to have to understand the two of them as being essentially in relation to one another. I should mention, just as a historical footnote, if we stay on the pragmatic side and think about thinkings as entertainings, judgings, and assertings. I was just talking about Dummett as seeing a big difference as to whether you took assertion to be the expression of a judgment or a judgment as the internalization of an assertion. One crucial issue in early modern philosophy, and one thing that properly separates us from them, has to do with the relation between those things, where they didn't mostly care about the sayable, took it for granted it was the judgeable, but the relation between that and the thinking in the sense of merely entertaining, that we see clearly in Descartes, but this goes on after him, the idea that we should be able to make sense of the notion of entertaining a thought first. Merely considering it as something that we could then invest our will in by an exercise of will, taking it to be true or false. But to be rational is first to entertain this thing, and then you think about, well, what reasons do I have? Should I endorse it or not? Entertaining first, judging coming second, with the judging thought of as plumping for it, investing your will in it. And this was crucial to the division between intellect and will, between understanding and volition, was this thought that the understanding comes first. And it was a relatively late coming thought. For many people, it was waited for the later Wittgenstein to have the thought that, oh, this is actually a fantasy. The idea that you could understand any thoughts, grasp any thoughts in advance of your having committed to some of them being true and others of them being false. That though there is indeed a difference between merely entertaining a thought and taking it to be true or taking it to be false, accepting or rejecting it in the way that's expressed by asserting or denying it, though there is a distinction, it's not so much as intelligible that someone should grasp these thoughts if all they'd yet done was entertain them. That to entertain some, so much as to entertain some thoughts, depends upon a background in which you have endorsed some and rejected others. And Frege, in his formal works, where he only allows us to make inferences from true claims, we can look at implication relations, but you only make inferences from true claims. You say, well, what about merely entertaining a claim? And he says, entertaining a claim is endorsing conditionals that have it as its antecedent. This act of entertaining is really thinking about what would follow from the claim, what would be evidence for it, what would be incompatible with it, and all of that you can understand in terms of endorsing conditionals and negated conditionals and conditionals of negations involving the claim. So that we really can take asserting and denying as the basic acts and understand entertaining as a relatively late coming capacity. And I mean, you will find this in young children, and you find it when you try and teach non-human primates language. The idea, this was the very first thing I asked Mike Tomasello when he's taking me around to see his various primates. I said, I'm not interested in people teaching them, another 20 signs for things. I want to know if you can teach them conditionals. Can you teach them if P then Q? If the light's on, then there's a biscuit in the cupboard, in the box that you can get if you open it. Can I teach him to understand that and not just go to open the box no matter whether the light is on or not? Because haven't I just said there's a biscuit in the box? Or being puzzled and just not knowing what's going on when I've uttered the sentence, the light is on, when the light obviously isn't on. That is just treating what I said as false. This distance from it that you get by embedding it as the antecedent of a conditional, which is the mere entertainment of it on this Fregean account. I said, that's what I want to know, whether the chimps can do. And Tomasello, who spent his life doing this, absolutely not. You will never be able to teach them to do that. That's one of the differences with human children. Human children cross this boundary. If they're young enough, they can't do it either, but at a certain point, they can. At any rate, when we're thinking about the relation between these different force-bearing notions, these different kinds of doings that you describe in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, I say, well, the relation between judging and asserting that Dummett was talking about, yeah, that's been a big difference between earlier times, sort of flip the valence, or have, as Davidson does, a relational account where judging and asserting all come as a package. You can't understand one or do one without the other. But there's a corresponding advance just having to do with the relation between entertaining and judging or asserting, where the tradition just took it for granted that entertaining came first, and judging with something intelligible in terms of that, plus something, an active will, a volition. And I think we've learned that that's not how things work, that nobody can learn to grasp these except by learning to accept and reject a bunch of other things. It's a relatively late coming capacity, and we can't describe what it would be to do that either. It's not just some psychological inability that we have. No, these come as a package. Okay, but, and I read out some passages in which he's talking about the peculiarity of the content of truth claims, that it doesn't go beyond the content of the claim that you're taking to be true. This is like the converse of the ampliativity question. Ampliativity question is, how can you get anything new out? Here he says, how can you be saying anything if the content doesn't change? What kind of a property is this that you attribute to something, but everything has got it? Every sentence has got it. Remember him making fun of the idea that objects all have in common that they're units, so that you wouldn't be saying anything about the dog if you said, oh, well, there's one of them, it's a unit. So he says there's this peculiarity on the side of content, but then he says, he said, the essence of what's expressed by true lies in the assertoric force. Yeah. If we merely use the assertoric sentence form and avoid the word true, two things must still be distinguished: the expression of the thought and the assertion, the truth which we acknowledge by using the assertoric sentence form. Somehow the essence of truth is to be found in what we're doing in asserting. So he says there's this intimate connection between the force of asserting and the content that we express with true. So on the side of the force, also somehow the property of truth consists in, well, it's acknowledged in, but our grip on it is in what we're doing in asserting, which is taking true. So truth is peculiar on the side of content in that it's sort of redundant, it seems contentless, and it's peculiar in its relation to force in that it seems that what we're expressing in the content of truth is what we're doing in asserting it. So that even somebody who doesn't have the word true understands the concept of truth because they assert things. That's all you need to understand the concept of truth, is to be able to take some things true in the sense of asserting them. How are we to understand these peculiarities about assertion and truth, which I think is really the philosophical basis for the indefinability of truth? It's these peculiarities about the content of true and its intimate relation to the most general and basic notion of force, namely assertional force. This really is something sui generis. There isn't anything like this. Remember, Dr. Frater Rorty, one of his parlor games was to invent new Christian heresies, and particularly Trinitarian heresies is one that I'll remember. God is three persons in one substance. Yes, are the persons different? That's one heresy. Are the persons the same? That's another. He said, yes. They stand in a sui generis relation of hypersimilarity to each other. There is no other example of this. The persons are not identical and they're not different. They're hypersimilar, and there are no other instances of hypersimilarity than this. He said, yeah, boy, he could have gotten a lot of people killed back in the day with this sui generis picture. Well, but now truth is, do we have to say the same thing about the way content and force are related in this particular case of the most important content notion and the most important force notion, assertion and truth? Are we left saying, well, this is sui generis, there's nothing like it, it just has these properties, and we don't understand more. We can specify this much about it. And here I find enlightening the following line of thought. Think about what you're doing when you take someone to know something. I say, John knows the light has turned red. Or vary the example. John knows there's a candle burning 10 feet in front of him. What am I doing when I do that? I think, well, you're attributing knowledge. I actually think you've already gone off the rails if you say that. I think you're doing three things. You're attributing a belief. I'd rather think of it as a commitment, but if John isn't committed to the claim, if he wouldn't assert there's a candle 10 feet in front of me, then my act of taking him to know that there is out of bounds. That's what corresponds to the belief condition in the classical JTB, justified true belief account of knowledge. But it's not merely an opinion that he has. I'm taking him to be entitled to it. He's justified in this belief. He has reasons for it. That's what corresponds to the justification condition. I'd prefer to think about that in deontic normative terms. He's entitled to this commitment, to this doxastic commitment. I'm attributing a commitment, attributing entitlement, attributing belief, attributing justification for that belief. What about the truth condition? What am I doing when I take it to be true? Well, I'm taking it to be true. I'm endorsing it myself. I'm not attributing anything to him in the way I attributed commitment and entitlement. I'm taking up a stance myself towards it. I'm endorsing it. That's what the truth condition is expressing. And the fact that we're tempted to say I'm attributing a property to what he is goes along with thinking I'm attributing a state to you when I attribute knowledge, but that's really not right. I'm attributing a belief, I'm attributing entitlement to the belief, and I'm committing myself to it. That doesn't have to do with you. That's what I'm doing, has to do with my relation to this content, not with your relation to it, and not with its relation to anything else, at least not to begin with, not if we think about what we're doing in that case. Asserting is taking true, so I'm asserting the claim that there's a candle 10 feet in front of him if I say that he knows it. And 2/3 of that is about him, but the other third is about me. It's expressing this hybrid normative stance that I'm taking up to him, attributing a commitment that comes with responsibilities to him. I'm attributing the entitlement, the authority that goes with that. And then I'm exercising my authority. I'm undertaking a responsibility myself in asserting it. And nothing but metaphysical confusion is going to come from assimilating what I'm doing when I endorse it to what I'm doing when I attribute the commitment or the entitlement to you. That's what's special about truth talk, if we think about it from the side of force, is that you're not attributing something to it. You're taking up a normative stance towards it. That's not describing it, that content, as having any property. It's mixing your will with it in the old-timey way of thinking, taking up a normative stance towards it. So I see I see knowledge talk as essentially involving this hybrid normative status. It's hybrid across the socially different perspectives that I can take to normative stances, attributing them to you, commitment and entitlement, or undertaking them myself, undertaking the commitment myself. So that's, okay, maybe sui generis, but it's intelligible if you put knowledge talk and truth talk in this social normative context. If you look at what the significance of calling something true is, that's not attributing a property to it. It's undertaking a commitment to it, an assertional commitment. It's accepting it.
I really like this picture. I like focusing on the commitments that we ourselves are undertaking when we attribute knowledge. I have a clarificatory question about the first thing that you said that we do when we attribute knowledge. You said other people might want to talk about this in terms of attributing belief. We prefer saying that we attribute a commitment. In some cases of knowledge attribution, those seem to me though like they're not interchangeable. I'm thinking of a case like I feel like that cases that really force us to say that we're attributing commitments rather than beliefs, that we shouldn't be talking in terms of beliefs. And one case I'm thinking of is the case where we say, well, John knows this, in a sense. John ought to know this. And there, if I'm saying that I'm attributing a commitment, I think that's right. And I'm attributing a commitment that the person might not explicitly
acknowledge
to undertake at all. And I'm insisting that there is a commitment.
I absolutely endorse what you're saying, and that's why belief is not one of my words.
Right.
Commitment is, they're not to be interchangeable.
Yeah.
My objection to the word belief, other than it's sort of hiding the normative character of it, is that it's not distinguishing between acknowledgement of a commitment, so something that either that I assert, or that if you ask me, I'd be willing to assert, right away, or the consequences of my commitments, the sense in which you believe the consequences of your beliefs, as it were, whether you believe them or not, the sense in which you are committed to them. Talking with commitment, I can talk about the ones that I acknowledge and the ones that are nonetheless attributable to me because they're consequences of the ones that I acknowledge. And among those consequences, we might distinguish between the ones where I acknowledge the consequential relation and the ones where I don't. And that, I think, is the difference between characterizing the commitment you're attributing de dicto or de re. In attributing the belief to you, I have to specify its content somehow. And that means getting the inferential role right. And what follows from it depends on what auxiliary hypotheses you can join with it to extract them, what consequences you would acknowledge. If I'm characterizing your belief de dicto, he believes that such and such. I'm saying you would acknowledge it under these terms, or that it follows by inferences that you would endorse, even if you maybe didn't see that, but that's still okay. If I do it de re, I'm saying, look, there's this true claim over here, my responsibility, not yours. And if you can join that with the thing he acknowledged, it actually has this consequence. So whether he knows it or not, in committing himself to this, he's committed himself to this thing that really follows from it. And that's de re characterization of, I want to say, the very same belief. There aren't two kinds of belief, those are two kinds of ascription. But talk of commitments, we can have the acknowledged commitments and the consequential commitments, both of which I license by making an assertion. I for sure license attributing the commitment that would be expressed in my mouth by uttering that sentence. I mean, that's important when we get to talk about Dr. Gustav Laubin here. But I also entitle you to license you to attribute to me commitments that follow, in fact, from the commitment I acknowledged, even if they follow in ways that I didn't see or even reject. Still, I have committed myself to this. If you claim the coin is copper, you have committed yourself to its conducting electricity. And maybe you don't know that about copper, but that's something you've committed yourself to, in the sense that if that isn't true, neither is what you said. Right, so anyway, that's you're articulating the sort of considerations that lead me to prefer talk about commitment to talk about belief.
You already brought it back to your very cool move of making this about two ways of ascribing, de re and de dicto ascribing are two different modes of profiles. That's really cool.
And two different specifications of the same content. You only have one, there's only one content to what you said, but it can be characterized in these different ways. Yeah, thereon hangs a tale about propositional attitude descriptions, but so on. But the view that the essence of truth lies in assertion, your grip on the notion of truth is your grip on what you're doing in asserting, has that view. And my giving this social perspectival analysis of the JTB account of knowledge, which, on the story I'm telling, is sort of right and sort of not right. I mean, it's right that there are these three things, a justification, a truth, and a belief condition. But it's not true that I am attributing those features to your state. I'm not attributing the property of truth to your belief. I'm endorsing the belief. Doing that is taking it to be true, but it's more fundamentally endorsing it, and that's about me, not about you. But that suggests that we give a force analysis of true in the way that metaethical expressivists said, when you say that's a good thing to do, you're really expressing your own attitude towards it, saying saying hurrah for doing that. And if you shouldn't do it, if it's a bad thing, you're saying boo. So the boo hurrah slogan for metaethical expressivism, which the Frege argument, distinguishing force and content, tells us can't be right full stop about good, bad, ought, and so on, because it's only an account of the freestanding use of these things, and they have embedded uses as well. That Frege argument would go through for an account of truth in terms of what you're doing in asserting as well. That can't be a complete account of the content, because we can also use true embedded in conditionals. We can negate it and so on. So we need an account of the content that goes beyond that force notion in order to account for its use as an embedded expression. And that's where, again, Frege has the key clue, as assertion was the clue to thinking about truth on the force side, even though as a monologician, thinking about the monologues that are mathematical proofs, you don't need to keep track of other people's deontic scores in that way. He wasn't thinking about the social perspectival difference between attributing a belief and endorsing the belief. That's the key to understanding the force use of true. But he for sure knows that embedding strips off the force, shows you the content naked of the force, unclothed by the force. And he gives us the clue about that too. Well, it's redundant as a content. It doesn't add any content. What's the paradigmatic use of that? Well, redundancy theories, disquotational theories, the version invented here in Pittsburgh, Grover, Camp, and Belknap, that I endorse is a prosentential view that sees true as a prosentence forming operator, where prosentences are like pronouns, except in the category of sentences. And the way to think about the content redundancy is to think of someone saying something, let's say the meaning of being is the being of meaning, and someone responding to that saying, that's profound, and someone else saying, and it's true. Now, the and it's true is not attributing something to it, it's endorsing it. But where does its content come from? It inherits its content from the speech act that is its anaphoric antecedent. There's another way of getting access to that Bedeutung, another way besides applying a function to an argument to get it. I can just inherit it from an antecedent in the way in which, if I say, John was confused about this point, but later on he got clear about it, in the way in which he just redundantly picks up John as its antecedent. It doesn't have the same sense as the word John, whatever that might be, but it has the same Bedeutung. It's a method of inheritance of Bedeutung. In the case of is true, it's a method of content inheritance. What did I endorse when I said, not only is that profound, it's true, I inherited the content of it from the anaphoric antecedent, from whatever I was calling true. So you can understand the embedded uses of true in this prosentential way. They're going to have the same content as some antecedent sentence. You just have to find out what that antecedent is, where it's inherited from. So actually, Frege had the key elements, both on the side of force. It's the unique connection between taking true and doing something, asserting, that gives us our grip and its significance. And it's redundant in these embedded uses, which it picks up from the force use, where I'm endorsing something but the something needn't be something I said. It can be coming from somewhere else. So, I mean, there's a lot of work technically to be done to make this sort of prosentential account work, but Grover Camp and Belknap started, and I've pursued this in a number of venues since. The ideas were there in Frege, and he saw this is a very special case and near and dear to his heart, but he needed some apparatus that he didn't have. He needed the more dialogic context to appreciate this difference of semantic social perspective between attributing a commitment and acknowledging it or endorsing it yourself in order to get the force of assertion and truth, the connection between those right, and some more sophisticated redundancy notion of the sort that Strawson developed or Quine did as disquotational, or various people have. I think the prosentential one has technical advantages, but we're all pulling in the same direction here. Okay, so that was context for the Bedeutung side, for the truth side, the truth assertional hierarchy that we have here. The next thing, which I'm not going to get to talk about today, but we can start off a little bit tomorrow. Next time. What I jocularly refer to in the handout as getting up close and personal with Gustav Lauben. That's because one of the things this essay is famous for is the treatment, is Frege being the first one to worry seriously about particularly indexical expressions, but now and here and I. This example is the occurrence of the word I in a sentence gives rise to some further questions. Consider the following case. Dr. Gustav Lauben says, I was wounded. Leo Peter hears this and remarks days later, Dr. Gustav Lauben has been wounded. Does this sentence express the same thought as the one Dr. Lauben uttered himself? Now here he is worried about the social perspectival case. Suppose that Rudolf Lingens was present when Dr. Lauben spoke, and now here's what's related by Leo Peter. If the same thought was uttered by Dr. Lauben and Leo Peter, then Rudolf Lingens, who is fully master of the language and remembers what Dr. Lauben said in his presence, must now know at once from Leo Peter's report that he's speaking of the same thing. Okay, if thoughts are not in time and space and don't have owners, what are we to think about the thoughts that are expressed by uses of the word now, here, and I? How can we find room for them? Okay, well, not time to do this now. Let's leave this for next time. I'll mention the Grundlich Frege Forschern sent their graduate students to determine whether there was a Dr. Gustav Lauben. They looked at all, since he was a doctor, they could look at all of the medical registries and other things and see. And it's been determined to their satisfaction that no, he made it up. These are the same people who you may remember early on in the Grundlagen, when he's complaining about Dedekind, saying, look, units can be anything. They could be the cars in the 812 train from Berlin. They also looked to see whether there was indeed an 812 train from Berlin to Jena or to anywhere else, and there wasn't. He just made it up, this guy who cares so much about truth. So then why Dr. Gustav Lauben? Why? And there is speculation in the literature even about this. And I have to pass this on. They say, well, don't think about the Gustav, just think about the initial. It's G. Lauben, it's Glauben. I leave you with this ridiculous thought, but it shows how obsessed you can get with things that really don't matter conceptually at all in the Frege text. And there are important things about the good doctor and his I thoughts, but we'll talk about those next time.